Welcome to the channel Nighttime Stories. I appreciate the support, comments and the interest you show in exploring ancient texts. In our previous lecture, we focused on the Satya Yuga, the era of original harmony, when there was no need for hard labor, laws or rulers. But the cosmic cycle is relentless. Virtue lost a quarter of its strength, and humanity entered a new period, the Treta Yuga. This era saw the emergence of the first homes, agriculture, strict rituals, and kings. Transitioning to this new way of life required new rules. The gods had to intervene differently, taking on the forms of warriors and rulers. This raises the question, how did society cope with the first crises of power, and what lessons did the sages encode in the Puranas and Mahabharata? We will trace this path using classical sources, analyze the motives of the heroes, and compare their actions with those of modern people. Transitions between world ages never happen all at once. The Puranas, especially the Vishnu Purana and Vayu Purana, describe this process as a depletion of the universe's spiritual potential. As we recall from the previous lecture, Indian cosmology uses the image of a bull symbolizing Dharma, the universal law and order. During the Satya Yuga, this bull stood firmly on 4 legs, representing the fullness of truth, compassion, asceticism, and purity. With the arrival of the Treta Yuga, one leg disappeared. My name is Michael Reynolds. You're watching Ancient Secrets. Thanks for watching my content. I'd appreciate your subscription and like. Enjoy the video. The loss of a quarter of virtue triggered changes in human physiology and the surrounding landscape. People lost the ability to communicate telepathically. Their bodies became denser and more vulnerable to external influences. According to surviving traditions, the earth was once covered by forests of kalpavriksha trees. These plants provided people with food, clothing, and all necessities at the mere thought of their mind. There was no need for effort to sustain life, build shelter, or make clothes. Society had no class divisions because resources were limitless and accessible to everyone. However, as the environment changed, the trees began to wither and bear fruit less frequently until they disappeared entirely. At the same time, the climate shifted. The uniform environment gave way to changing seasons. The first rains fell, winds blew, and the sun began to burn the skin. The change of seasons disrupted familiar biological rhythms. The human body had to adapt to withstand temperature fluctuations. Deprived of their usual source of nourishment and protection, people encountered hunger for the first time. They needed to protect their bodies from the elements. Until then, shelters had been natural caves. Now, engineering solutions were required. People began gathering stones, cutting down dried tree trunks, mixing clay with dry grass, and constructing the first dwellings. Simple huts appeared, followed by more complex structures with roofs and hearths. Nature ceased to be a safe home and became a resource, often a hostile environment that had to be confronted daily. The need arose to create warm clothing from animal hides and plant fibers. Following architecture, agriculture emerged. Gathering wild roots and berries was no longer sufficient to feed growing settlements. For the first time, humans took tools made of stone and bone, broke the earth's surface, and sowed seeds in furrows. Ancient texts mention barley and wheat as the first cultivated plants. Along with farming came the domestication of wild animals. Oxen became draft animals, easing the ploughing of hard soil, and cows began providing milk, becoming part of the diet. Growing crops required time, planning, and staying in one place for several months. Planting demanded the creation of the first calendars. People had to study the movement of stars and the phases of the moon to determine the right times for sowing and harvesting. A sedentary lifestyle led to the concept of private property. Fertile land plots, sources of fresh water, and harvested crops acquired specific owners. To mark their boundaries, farmers began using stones and wooden stakes. The distinction between mine and yours emerged. Physical labor became the foundation of society's survival. This transition offers a fascinating subject for analysis. The change in living conditions for ancient people parallels how modern humans react to sudden loss of comfort. Deprivation of basic conveniences causes stress, denial, and then mobilizes inner resources to adapt to new realities. The difference lies in scale. We might lose electricity, internet, or supply chains, while people at the start of the Treta Yuga lost the ability to control matter and harness thought to manifest desires from the ether. By ploughing the land, clearing forests, and building walls, humans began investing their energy and irreplaceable time into these objects. The Upanishads indicate that at this moment, attachment to material goods arose in people's consciousness. An object earned through labor gained great value in the owner's eyes. Fear of losing accumulated possessions due to poor harvests, drought, or wild animals created anxieties unknown to the people of the previous era. The accumulation of surplus grain led to social inequality. Those who gathered larger harvests could exchange it for other goods, freeing themselves from some labor. Protecting their granaries, fields, and homes became a priority for every farmer. Dependence on weather conditions made people look to the sky with hope and fear, leading to the development of complex rituals intended to appease natural forces. Disputes over land boundaries sparked the first interpersonal conflicts. Arguments over fertile riverbank plots, water distribution for irrigation, and the security of harvested grain required systematic solutions. Society grew more complex, and the equality of the Satya Yuga disappeared completely. A need arose for a clear division of labor. The Rig Veda, particularly the Purusha Sukta hymn, describes the formation of the four Varnas as a cosmic act. From the mouth of the first man came the priests, the Brahmins. From his arms, the warriors, the Kshatriyas. From his thighs, the farmers and merchants, the Vaishyas. And from his feet, the servants, the Shudras. The Puranas add a practical explanation. People began performing duties that matched their skills. Those with physical strength took on the task of protecting the settlement from wild animals and raids by neighbours, forming the Kshatriya caste. The emergence of professional warriors naturally led to the establishment of royal authority. The Upanishads provide a philosophical justification for power. The king is the guarantor of stability. Without a ruler, society falls into a state described as Matyanya, the law of the fish, where the big fish devours the small. To prevent chaos, the king was granted the right to enforce punishment. Military power, tax collection for maintaining the army, and judicial authority were concentrated in his hands. The affirmation of the ruler was accompanied by complex rituals such as the Rajasuya. During this ceremony, the king made offerings to the gods, confirming his status as the link between celestial order and earthly law. This shift from contemplation, characteristic of the previous era, to strict external action is a particularly intriguing phenomenon. People of the Treta Yuga stopped seeking answers solely through meditation. They began building social hierarchies, writing codes of law, and constructing fortified cities. Life became regulated. Temporary shelters gave way to houses made of baked bricks and wood, surrounded by protective moats and earthen walls. Within settlements, markets developed where the Vaishyas exchanged grain for crafts. Priests conducted rituals, farmers provided food, and Kshatriyas ensured the security of the system. In the early stages, this system functioned effectively. Rulers adhered to Dharma, their duty to protect their subjects and respect the spiritual authority of the priests. Traditionally, the king collected 1/10 of the harvest as tax, a share considered a fair price for the farmer's peace of mind. However, the concentration of power carried inherent risks. Over time, the warrior caste began to lose sight of its original purpose. After conquering neighbouring tribes and securing the borders, the warriors found themselves without external enemies. Large armies required constant supplies, and royal palaces demanded upkeep. The rulers turned their power against their own people. The taxation system became a tool for confiscation. Kings began to arbitrarily increase their share, sometimes taking half the harvest, condemning entire villages to famine. The warriors, once tasked with guarding the granaries, became the ones emptying them. The rulers' greed grew unchecked. Soon, they encroached upon the lands and wealth of the spiritual class. The priests, who by law were exempt from taxes and lived off donations, became victims of oppression. Warriors confiscated their cattle, which were considered the main measure of wealth and essential for producing clarified butter, a key element in sacred rituals. Armed detachments destroyed forest hermitages and interrupted complex ceremonies. Folklore scholars interpret this narrative as reflecting a real historical conflict between the priestly and warrior elites of ancient India. It was a struggle for supremacy. Who should govern the state, the bearers of sacred knowledge, or the holders of physical power? The epic texts mention kings from this era, such as Kartavirya Arjuna, ruler of the High people. He was said to possess 1,000 arms and a vast army, conquering many lands, but his pride blinded him. According to legend, during a hunt, the king visited the hermitage of the sage Jamadagni. The sage honored the king and fed his entire army with the help of a miraculous wish-granting cow. Instead of gratitude, Kartavirya Arjuna ordered his soldiers to seize the cow and her calf by force and take them to the capital, showing disregard for hospitality and spiritual norms. Such behavior became common among rulers of that age. They grew confident in their impunity. This raises a vital question. What defines a king if he becomes a source of chaos? Indian political thought faced a systemic crisis. The means of restraint ceased to function. The priests held knowledge but lacked weapons. Farmers were impoverished and intimidated. The king, meant to uphold the law, became its chief violator. The strict hierarchy, created to prevent anarchy, failed and gave rise to tyranny. The state apparatus turned into a machine for oppressing its own people. This historical deadlock called for radical intervention. When the state becomes an instrument of oppression, an external force becomes necessary. Indian mythology answers this with the appearance of the sixth avatar of Vishnu during the Treta Yuga, Parashurama. His biography is detailed in other discussions, so here we focus on the fact of his arrival and the reasons behind this intervention in history. The warrior caste, originally created to protect society, became intoxicated with power. The text described this as the degradation of the ruling elite. Kings forgot their duty. Instead of guarding the borders, they began plundering their own people. Taxes became unbearable for farmers. Armed squads regularly raided villages, forcibly taking portions of the harvest, craft goods, and draft animals. Cattle were the main indicator of wealth at the time, providing milk, butter for temple rituals, and serving as currency. The rulers seized herds from peasants and the priestly class. The Brahmin priests, custodians of knowledge and ritual, were helpless against the king's cavalry and infantry. The symbol of this systemic failure was King Kartavirya Arjuna. The epic attributes to him 1,000 arms, a metaphor for military might, mastery of various weapons, and territorial control. Kartavirya had resources, but his ambitions demanded more. Parashurama came into this world not to engage in philosophical debates or lecture rulers on morality. According to legend, he trained on Mount Kailash under the god Shiva, mastering martial arts and weaponry. In his hands was the battle axe Parashu. Parashurama travelled to Kartavirya's capital, fought the regular army alone, and killed the king by severing his 1,000 arms. But the conflict did not end there. The king's sons, seeking revenge, waited until Parashurama left the forest, then attacked the hermitage of Jamadagni, killing the sage while he was in meditation. Upon returning and seeing his mother mourning her husband, Parashurama made a solemn vow. The texts say she struck her chest 21 times in grief. In response, Parashurama swore to cleanse the land of the warrior caste 21 times over. He began systematically eliminating the ruling elite from the Himalayas to the southern oceans. He spared no king who had broken the law, leaving empty thrones in their wake. The political landscape was cleared of those who should have guaranteed stability, but instead became sources of terror. The epic mentions a place called Samanta Panchaka, where Parashurama created 5 lakes from the blood of the fallen rulers, performing a ritual offering to his ancestors. Scholars generally interpret this myth as reflecting an ancient historical conflict. Researchers see the story of Parashurama as a chronicle of the power struggle between the 2 highest castes of ancient India, the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas. The priests sought to maintain ideological control over society and resource distribution, while the warriors, wielding force, sought to subjugate the priesthood. With the development of agriculture and surplus grain, kings aimed to centralize wealth in their hands. The myth captures a period when the balance of power was so disrupted that a reset of the governance system became necessary. This raises the question, what happens to society when the law ceases to function? Parashurama's story shows that unchecked power inevitably provokes a response of equal force. When institutions of justice deteriorate, society returns to basic self-regulation mechanisms. Justice is restored through the physical removal of the source of threat. Parashurama's harsh measures were a reaction to the systemic illness of Treta Yuga society. He acted as a surgeon, excising diseased tissue to save the organism. After cleansing the land of tyrants, he entrusted governance to the sage Kashyapa and withdrew to the Mahendra Mountains to perform ascetic practices. However, the absence of a ruling class soon created a power vacuum, necessitating the formation of a new elite. Restoring order to the devastated lands required rulers of a different kind. The Treta Yuga needed not enforcers but builders, leaders able to establish law through their personal example. It was during this period that two major royal lineages of ancient India began to take shape: the Solar dynasty, Suryavamsha, and the Lunar dynasty, Somavamsha. Membership in these houses would define the political landscape of the subcontinent for a millennium. The rulers of these new dynasties laid the foundation for events that would shape the cultural identity of South Asia. Many of these stories are explored in detail elsewhere, so here we touch on them only to provide general context. The key text of this era is the Ramayana epic, which recounts the life of Vishnu's seventh avatar, Rama, Prince of Ayodhya, belonging to the Solar dynasty. Unlike Parashurama, Rama operated within strict social boundaries. His journey exemplifies the perfect fulfillment of the duties of a ruler, son, and husband. The poem, traditionally attributed to the sage Valmiki, provides a detailed account of life during that era. Within the verses of the Ramayana, we find precise descriptions of royal palace architecture, featuring spacious halls and inner courtyards, as well as lists of weapons such as bows and darts, along with the rules governing Vedic rituals. The central conflict of the epic revolves around Rama's voluntary exile. Obeying his father's vow, the prince leaves the capital without resistance and ventures into the Dandaka forest for 14 years. This forest is described as a wild, impenetrable region inhabited by hermits and dangerous tribes. It is there that his wife Sita is abducted by the demon Ravana, setting the stage for a grand military campaign against the island of Lanka, which required the construction of a stone bridge across the ocean. Historians still debate the exact geographical location of ancient Lanka. Some identify it with the modern island nation of Sri Lanka, based on descriptions of limestone shoals between the mainland and the island, known in cartography as Rama's Bridge. Others, analysing botanical markers, river names and climatic features mentioned in the Ramayana, suggest that Ravana's kingdom may have been located much further north, near the Vindhya mountain range. Regardless of its precise location, the siege of Lanka serves as an example of how the society of the Treta Yuga understood the struggle between an organised state and the forces of chaos. Another important legend closely tied to the values of this era is the story of King Bali and the youth Vamana. Bali, leader of the Asuras, gained immense power through prolonged austerities and large-scale fire sacrifices. He managed to drive the gods from the heavens and claim dominion over the three worlds. Deprived of their abodes, the gods sought protection from Vishnu. Vishnu took the form of a dwarf Brahmin named Vamana, dressed in deerskin, carrying a wooden staff and measuring rod, and appeared on the banks of the Narmada River. There, King Bali was performing a complex ritual, distributing gifts to priests. According to Vedic ceremony rules of the Treta Yuga, the organizer of a sacrifice was obliged to grant any request made by a guest. Vamana approached the altar and asked for a piece of land he could measure with 3 steps. Bali's chief advisor, the sage Shukracharya, who had the gift of foresight, recognized the dwarf as a deity. He tried to dissuade the king, warning that he would lose everything. However, Bali, bound by his public oath, took a vessel of water and washed the guests' feet, sealing the agreement. At that moment, Vamana began to grow rapidly, assuming his cosmic form, Trivikrama. With the first step, he covered the entire earth. With the second, he spanned the heavens. For the third step, there was no space left in the universe. Recognizing his complete defeat and unwilling to break his word, King Bali bowed his head and offered his own head for the deity's foot. Vishnu, acknowledging the ruler's unwavering honesty, spared his life and sent him to govern the underworld realm of Patala. Both of these stories convey a similar message. They illustrate the dangers of inflated ego and the inevitable downfall of those who place personal ambition above the established cosmic order. Ravana relied on physical invulnerability granted by the god Brahma and military might. Bali prided himself on his exceptional righteousness and amassed wealth. In both cases, intervention by higher powers was necessary to restore balance. Analyzing these texts provides insight into the foundational principles of a bygone era. The readiness to fulfill one's duty was valued above all material achievements. Since the major military conflicts and deeds of the principal avatars have already been covered in previous materials, this lecture will shift focus. We will turn to other Puranic legends to explore how ordinary people of the Treta Yuga faced everyday decisions from a fresh perspective. Our interest lies not so much in the fields of great battles, as in the quiet forest retreats where destinies were shaped and decisions made whose consequences were felt for centuries. One such place was deep within a dense thicket, far from trade routes and royal capitals. Hidden from the eyes of farmers and warriors, the sage Chivana practiced austerity. He belonged to the ancient lineage of the sage Bhrigu, known for exceptional concentration abilities. According to the Mahabharata and Shatapatha Brahmana texts, his spiritual practice involved complete stillness and total withdrawal from interaction with the outside world. In Indian tradition, this process of accumulating inner energy is called tapas. The ascetic generated an internal heat that transformed his body and mind, subordinating matter to spirit. Years passed. The hermit's body became covered with layers of dust and fallen leaves. Gradually, a large anthill formed around him. Insects built earthen domes over his head, and creeping vines entwined his figure, finally concealing the person within a natural mound. Chivana continued to breathe and concentrate energy, fully merging with the landscape. This form of meditation serves as a marker of the Treta Yuga. At that time, control over physiology was considered the highest achievement, allowing a person to transcend basic needs. After a long time, King Shariati, a descendant of the progenitor of humanity Manu, arrived in the area. The ruler travelled with his retinue, warriors, and his daughter, Princess Sukanya. Moving a royal court in that era was a massive undertaking. The camp consisted of hundreds of wagons, tents, food stores, and enclosures for draft animals. They set up camp at the forest's edge, near a fresh water source. While servants prepared the camp, lit fires, and cooked food for the army, the young princess set out with her companions to explore the surroundings. The Puranas describe her as curious, but lacking understanding of the spiritual laws governing the forest. As she wandered among the trees, Sukanya came upon an abandoned clearing. In its centre stood an old anthill, overgrown with tall grass. Approaching the earthen mound, she noticed an unusual sight. Through narrow cracks in the dry clay, a faint glow emanated. Two small lights burned steadily, without flickering. The princess did not know the nature of this phenomenon. The glow came from the eyes of the sage Chivana. The years of tapas he had accumulated had materialized as a physical light known in the texts as tejas, energy of spiritual radiance. Driven by curiosity, she picked up a sharp branch from the ground. She inserted the wooden tip through a hole in the anthill and touched the glowing points. The lights instantly went out. Unwittingly, the girl deprived the powerful sage of his sight. Physical pain pulled the ascetic from his deep trance. The wrath of the sage, interrupted at the moment of highest concentration, fell upon the entire royal camp. Chivana did not use physical weapons. Instead, he wielded the power of his will, remotely blocking the life energy in the bodies of those within the camp's territory. Suddenly, warriors, draft animals, and King Shariati himself felt a sharp malaise. The texts indicate that the army was struck by specific ailments. In both humans and horses, natural cleansing processes ceased entirely. Panic spread through the camp as the increasing physical pain quickly rendered the soldiers incapable of fighting. King Shariati immediately understood what was happening. In the Treta Yuga, rulers studied cause and effect relationships in detail. They knew that a sudden, unexplained mass illness among troops was a direct consequence of offending a person endowed with spiritual power. The king began a rigorous interrogation of his retinue. Sukanya confessed her actions in the forest clearing. Upon learning the truth, Shariati promptly set out for the earthen mound. He ordered his servants to carefully dismantle the anthill and cut the vines. Standing before the blinded elder, the king bowed deeply to the ground, pleading for forgiveness and asking how he might atone for the damage caused by his daughter's actions. This episode calls for a detailed examination from the perspective of Dharma, the ruler's duty. Some scholars believe this story reflects the conflict between inexperienced youth and accumulated spiritual power. Sukanya acted without ill intent. Her deeds stemmed solely from a lack of understanding about the world's order and an inability to perceive the hidden essence behind outward appearances. However, the laws of karma, as outlined in Vedic literature, operate independently of a person's intentions. The mechanics of the universe in the era of Treta Yuga are such that a single careless act sets off a chain of consequences. These repercussions affect not only the one responsible, but also everyone around them, in this case, an entire army and the infrastructure of the royal camp. The situation vividly illustrates the principle of personal responsibility. Ignorance of natural laws does not exempt one from the obligation to make amends for the harm caused. King Shariati does not attempt to excuse his daughter based on her youth or her status as heir. Instead, he accepts the fact that members of his family have disrupted the cosmic order and prepares to take responsibility for restoring the lost balance. King Shariati turns to the blinded sage, asking what price must be paid for redemption. At this moment, the king's army is physically paralyzed. The ascetic's anger has blocked the natural processes within the soldiers' bodies and the draft animals. Vital bodily functions have ceased entirely, making further movement of the camp or any resistance impossible. Chavana sets a condition. He will lift the curse from the king's army only if Princess Sukanya becomes his wife and remains in the forest to care for him until the end of his days. In translations of the original Sanskrit texts, such as the Shatapatha Brahmana and Mahabharata, this dialogue is described in a very restrained manner, without excess emotion. The king feels the weight of this proposal, aware of the difference in age, social status, and living conditions. A marriage between a young member of the ruling Kshatriya class and an elderly hermit from the Brahmin caste disrupts the established order. Yet, the decision is made by the young woman herself. Sukanya comprehends the magnitude of the consequences of her actions. She steps forward and consents to the union with the blind sage, choosing to save her father's army and restore the disrupted law of Dharma. The wedding ritual takes place right there in the forest clearing, witnessed by the sacred fire of Agni. Immediately after the ceremony, the transition from palace life to ascetic living occurs physically. The princess removes her heavy gold necklaces, bracelets, and silk garments, handing them to her attendants. She dresses in wolfskin, the traditional clothing of forest hermits, woven from coarse tree bark fibers. The royal entourage turns back and leaves the area. The young woman remains alone with her husband in a simple hut, its walls woven from bamboo and roofed with dry palm leaves. From that day forward, her daily reality changes completely. Instead of marble palace floors, there is damp earth. Instead of numerous servants, she must provide for the survival of 2 people on her own. Life in the forest hermitage demands constant physical labour. Sukanya wakes long before sunrise. She must go down to the river for water, carry heavy clay pots back, then venture into the thicket to gather edible roots, wild fruits, and dry branches. A special task is to find kusha grass and fresh bilva leaves, which the sage needs for his morning offerings. The fire is the centre of the Brahmin's life, and the care of maintaining its flame now rests entirely on the former princess's shoulders. Beyond household duties, she becomes the physical eyes of her husband. Sukanya leads Chavana by the hand to the river for daily ablutions, protecting him from poisonous snakes, protruding roots, thorny bushes, and predators. She endures harsh climate changes. Scorching heat gives way to the monsoon rains. When the hut's roof leaks, the forest paths become muddy and impassable. The sage's character presents its own challenges. A decade of strict discipline, the accumulation of inner energy, and sudden loss of sight have made Chavana demanding. The Puranas explicitly state that he often tested his wife, was strict, and required absolute adherence to ritual purity and practice schedules. She did not resent his temperament. She prepared his food, washed his feet, cared for his clothing, and never uttered a word of complaint about her fate. There was no bitterness toward her father, who had left her in the wilderness, nor toward her husband, who had taken away her status as heir. According to Indological research, this story vividly illustrates the key educational paradigm of that time, the concept of conscious atonement. In the era of Treta Yuga, a person viewed a grave mistake not as a reason to seek excuses, but as a direct karmic duty requiring immediate repayment. Sukanya committed an error that deprived a living being of sight. The natural consequence was her obligation to become a functional replacement for the lost organ of perception. This historical example of accepting responsibility marks a shift in human thinking. Modern society often builds psychological mechanisms to avoid difficulties. When faced with the direct consequences of their actions, people tend to look for someone else to blame, cite circumstances or age, or fall into self-pity. The ability to voluntarily give up a comfortable life to atone for one's mistake is now seen as a social anomaly. For Sukanya, however, this choice became a means of preserving her inner integrity. She embraced her new role not as an external punishment, but as service, methodically transforming arduous daily labor into a personal spiritual practice. Her calm acceptance of hardship and strict dedication to her commitments gradually began to change the energy of the space around the forest hermitage, preparing events for a new phase. This altered energy could not go unnoticed by higher powers. Years passed, and the routine of forest life was interrupted by the arrival of unusual visitors. As ancient Vedic texts recount, including hymns from the Rig Veda and later tales from the Mahabharata, the celestial physicians known as the Ashvini Kumars often travelled between worlds. These twin brothers held a special place in the Vedic pantheon. They were considered healers of the gods, experts in anatomy, and masters of the ancient science of tissue rejuvenation. Their appearance was always associated with a transition from darkness to light, from illness to health. One day, their golden chariot passed over the forest where Chavana's hermitage stood. Descending to the earth, the divine twins saw Sukanya. The young woman, dressed in coarse bark clothing, was performing hard physical labor, caring for the blind and infirm elder. The Shatapatha Brahmana preserves an earlier version of their meeting. According to this source, the Ashvini Kumars initially tried to test the princess verbally. They pointed to her husband's physical decline and offered her a choice to leave the old man and select one of them, eternally young and powerful deities. Sukanya categorically rejected this proposal, citing the unbreakable nature of her vows. Her steadfastness compelled the celestial healers to change their approach. Moved by such devotion, the brothers offered a deal that becomes a key turning point in the story. They promised to use their knowledge to fully restore Shivana's sight and return youth to his body. An interesting historical note: tradition attributes the authorship of a well-known rejuvenation recipe precisely to this event. The popular Ayurvedic formulation known today as Shivanpraj is literally translated as Shivana's food. According to ancient medical texts, it was the Ashvini Kumars who passed down the formula for restoring the cells of the body. However, for Sukanya to heal her husband, she had to pay a high price. The condition was that once the elder regained his youthful form, the young woman would have to choose her husband anew from among the three identical figures before her. The risk was that a wrong choice would strip her of her status as a faithful wife, undoing all the years of dedication and effort she had invested. Chavana agreed to these terms. The transition ritual required the use of water, which in Indian cosmology often serves as a boundary between different states of being. The elements have the power to dissolve old forms and generate new ones. The divine twins and the blind sage entered the cool waters of a forest lake and submerged completely. Sukanya remained on the shore, waiting for the process to conclude. After some time, the surface of the water began to stir. 3 young men emerged onto the shore. The transformation was a complete success, but the result left the princess puzzled. Before her stood 3 identical figures. They were the same height, with identical facial features, symmetrical builds, and equally radiant skin. There were no scars, wrinkles, or any other physical characteristics that people usually use to recognize their loved ones. The Ashvini Kumars turned to Sukanya, reminding her of her obligation to identify her rightful husband. Scholars of epics and folklore classify this story as a motif of testing illusions. In Indian philosophy, this phenomenon is known as Maya, the energy capable of creating forms and concealing the true essence of things. The gods use Maya not to mock, but to test the depth of human perception. During the Treta Yuga, when society began placing increasing importance on outward signs of power and status, this myth took on a special educational significance. It demonstrates the limitations of the physical senses. Sight, which people usually rely on first, proved utterly useless in this situation. A natural question arises: how can one recognize the essence of a person when the outer appearance becomes identical to the divine ideal, and the usual markers of age, illness, and physical flaws are completely erased? Faced with 3 identical young men, Sukanya refused to rely on logic or visual analysis to solve the challenge. The Mahabharata tells us that the princess closed her eyes and mentally appealed to higher powers. She asked for clarity of mind, as her physical senses were powerless against the divine illusion. After a few moments of concentration, she opened her eyes and began to carefully examine the subtle details hidden behind the perfect proportions of their bodies. At that moment, clear physiological differences between the celestial beings and mortals became apparent. Sukanya noticed that 2 of the young men stared unblinkingly. Their eyelids remained still. They did not blink. Their feet hovered several inches above the ground, not touching the earth or leaving any marks on the forest grass. Around their necks hung garlands of lotus flowers, and the petals looked as if they had been picked just moments before, fresh and free of any wilting or dust. Moreover, the bodies of these divine healers cast no shadows on the ground, despite the bright sunlight. In ancient Indian tradition, the presence of a shadow was considered a sign of material density. Gods, composed of subtle energy or radiant light, are transparent to sunlight. Looking closely at the 3rd young man, Sukanya saw a different picture. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. He blinked occasionally, protecting his eyes from the light. His feet were firmly planted on the ground, crushing the grass beneath them, and his body cast a dark shadow. The garland around his neck had already begun to lose moisture. The edges of the petals darkened and drooped under the heat of the day. Confidently, Sukanya stepped forward and took the hand of this young man. It was Chivana. In the Rig Veda, the Ashvini Kumars are described as riders heralding the dawn and the chief healers of the pantheon. Their speciality is restoring what has been lost, whether health, youth, or body parts injured in battle. Their ability to restore the sage's sight perfectly aligns with their cosmic role. The Ashvini Kumars, whose illusion was broken by the princess's keen perception, felt no anger. On the contrary, the divine twins admired Sukanya's wisdom. They blessed the couple with a long life, mounted their celestial chariot, and returned to their heavenly abode. Jivana remained beside his wife, forever preserving his restored body. From the perspective of modern biology, the exact timing of the appearance of these specific traits distinguishing gods from humans remains a topic of debate. This motif of testing fidelity appears repeatedly in Indian epics. The most well-known parallel is found in the story of King Nala and Princess Damayanti. There, the princess is similarly forced to choose a husband among 4 gods who have taken his form. The same markers are used: absence of sweat, unblinking gaze, hovering above the ground, and unfading flowers. Scholars suggest that this set of signs developed during the transition between the Vedic era and the time of the Puranas, becoming a stable literary canon. These physical details carry philosophical meaning. The gods' unblinking gaze symbolizes their existence beyond the flow of time. They contemplate eternity and do not need to measure seconds by blinking. Their hovering above the earth indicates their detachment from the material world. They are not bound by gravity, nor burdened by karma, and they leave no traces in history as mortals do. The unfading garlands represent the static perfection of the divine realm, where nothing is born and nothing dies. Human nature is woven from change. The fact that Chivana blinked, breathed, and stood firmly on the ground revealed his connection to a world governed by time. The wilting lotus garland was a marker of entropy. In the human world, every breath brings the organism closer to its end. The gods are free from this process. Their biological clocks are stopped. The withering flowers on the sage's neck served as direct proof of his susceptibility to aging and mortality. These vulnerabilities are what make a person truly alive. Analyzing this story, we encounter the concept of embracing human imperfection. Sukanya chooses the dynamic, temporal ideal. She chooses a man connected to the earth, who experiences fatigue, and whose body obeys the laws of nature. By choosing Chivana, she consciously accepts the responsibility of being with someone who will inevitably change and eventually leave this world. In the context of Treta Yuga philosophy, this signifies recognition of the value of earthly experience. Divine perfection is detached and effortless to maintain. Human life requires constant effort and care. Sukanya's choice shows that for a loving person, true value lies not in a flawless exterior, but in sharing the journey through the trials of time together. The nature of Treta Yuga was expressed not only in the quiet of forest hermitages. While some sought meaning in overcoming their own weaknesses, others directed their energy outward. As social structures grew more complex, personal trials gave way to state challenges. The idea of facing hardships together expanded to entire peoples. Rulers of this era sought to establish their authority over vast territories. The main tool for asserting power became a complex, multi-stage ritual. The Ramayana, Mahabharata, and various Puranas all describe the story of King Sagara. He ruled a powerful state, had a developed economy, and commanded a large army. Yet the status of a local ruler no longer satisfied his ambitions. Sagara decided to perform the Ashvamedha, the horse sacrifice. This ritual was not merely a religious act, but a symbol of supreme political authority in ancient India. Only a monarch aspiring to the title of universal emperor, whose influence knew no bounds, could perform it. Preparing for the ceremony required mobilizing the nation's resources. Priests carefully selected a horse with specific physical traits. The animal had to have a particular coloring, often white with dark spots on its head and tail, and be free of any defects. After initial rites, including purification and chanting of mantras, the horse was released to roam freely for exactly 1 year. It was followed by an elite army led by the kingdom's best generals. Organizing such a campaign demanded constant supply of provisions, establishment of camps, and construction of roads. Farmers and craftsmen were subjected to additional taxes to support this mobile force. The rules of this ceremony were strict. Wherever the sacrificial horse's hooves touched the ground, that land was declared the property of King Sagara. Local rulers faced a choice: acknowledge vassalage, meet the army with gifts, and join their forces to the horse's retinue, or refuse and engage in armed resistance against the advancing army. Thus, the horse functioned as a living instrument of territorial expansion, provoking conflicts along borders and testing neighbouring states. For many months, Sagara's horse roamed unhindered across plains, forded rivers, and entered dense forests. The army suppressed any resistance, annexing new lands. The monarch's influence grew. Ancient texts note that such concentration of earthly power inevitably disturbed the balance of forces. The celestial ruler Indra took notice of Sagara's successes. According to Vedic cosmology, ritual acts generate a special energy compelling the universe to obey human will. Completing 100 such horse sacrifices would grant the earthly king the right to displace Indra and claim his throne. Fearing loss of his divine status, the heavenly sovereign decided to intervene. Taking an invisible form, he descended to earth, infiltrated the camp unnoticed, abducted the sacrificial horse, and hid it deep within the subterranean realm. There is an intriguing theory that this myth encodes real historical processes behind the formation of early large states. Scholars interpret the horse sacrifice as an allegory for aggressive geopolitics. Once a state reached a certain level of economic and military strength, it developed a need to expand. This need was often disguised as fulfilling a sacred duty or civilizational mission. Empire building required constant movement. Stagnation was seen as vulnerability. The ruler's ambitions became the driving force behind the state apparatus, yet also its weakness. Political expansion always faced resource shortages. Extending borders increased supply lines and the number of external enemies, which in turn demanded further expansion to create buffer zones. This created a vicious cycle, drawing tens of thousands into conflict. Ordinary soldiers spent years away from their families, while peasants sacrificed their harvest to support imperial ambitions, paying the price for one man's desire for dominance. When King Sagara learned of the horse's disappearance, he faced the threat of public disgrace. An incomplete ceremony was not simply a cancelled celebration, it jeopardized the ruler's reputation and risked rebellion in newly acquired territories. Vassals who had accepted Sagara's authority out of fear might see the loss of the horse as weakness and withdraw their allegiance. The monarch found himself hostage to his own quest for absolute control. Recovering the horse at any cost became imperative. Otherwise, the entire complex system of subjugation would collapse, burying the very idea of a unified state. Driven by the threat to his prestige, King Sagara acted swiftly. He entrusted the search for the missing horse to his sons. It is worth noting the monarch's lineage. Ancient epics mention that he had 2 wives. The first bore a single heir, Asamandaja. The second wife gave birth to an extraordinary offspring, which sages divided into 60,000 parts. These embryonic fragments were placed in sealed vessels filled with clarified butter, where they matured over a long period until they became fully formed young men. This army of princes was dispatched to scour the empire's lands. 60,000 armed heirs set out. Their search resembled a military invasion. The princes did not merely survey territories, they reshaped the landscape. In pursuit of the horse, they destroyed rocks, cut down forests, and razed settlements. Texts describe how they dug into the earth with iron shovels, maces and crowbars, confronting subterranean serpents, spirits, and forest dwellers. They reached the edge of the world, where they encountered elephants believed, according to Indian cosmology, to carry the earth on their backs. This episode illustrates how crowds, intoxicated by impunity and inherited status, lose their capacity for reason. The collective sense of entitlement blinded them. Having searched the surface without finding the horse, the princes decided to break into the lower realms. According to ancient epics, this earth-breaking by Sagara's sons gave the name to the world ocean in Sanskrit. Their breakthrough through the earth's crust led them to Patala, the netherworld layer of existence. There, the princes finally found what they sought. The sacrificial horse grazed on an open plain. Nearby sat a man in deep meditation. This was the sage Copula. Sources identify Copula as an incarnation of the god Vishnu and the founder of the philosophical system Samkhya. This school describes the universe through the interaction of 2 principles: pure consciousness, Purusha, and material nature, Prakriti. The sage was in a state of detachment from the material world. His mind was focused on inner silence, and his body remained motionless for many years. Peace reigned around him, but Sagara's sons could not perceive such states. Blinded by pride and weariness from their search, they saw only an old man beside their goal. The crowd's logic was simple. Whoever is near the missing horse must be the thief. The princes surrounded the sage in a ring. They began shouting insults and raising swords and spears. Preparing to strike, They violated the fundamental rule of interacting with ascetics, breaking the long process of concentration. The noise and threats disturbed Copula's trance. He opened his eyes slightly. At that moment, accumulated energy was released. In Indian tradition, there is the concept of tapas, an inner heat generated by decades of ascetic practice, breath control, and mastery of the senses. Copula's gaze acted like a lens, focusing this heat into a single point. From his eyes burst forth a stream of flame. This fire was not a physical weapon, but a manifestation of spiritual power, disturbed by external interference. The flames instantly engulfed the attackers. In seconds, 60,000 warriors were reduced to piles of ash. This narrative illustrates the direct clash of two opposing forms of power. On one side, physical strength multiplied by numbers. The king's sons relied on external attributes, weapons, forces, and royal lineage. They acted loudly and destructively, sweeping away obstacles. On the other side stood spiritual concentration, completely devoid of outward display. Copula had no guards, wore no armor, and uttered no words in his defense. The nature of this conflict reveals the danger of underestimating calm individuals. Outward stillness is often mistaken by aggressors for weakness and vulnerability. The rulers and their entourages were accustomed to strength being displayed through shouting, threats, and physical intimidation. When faced with silence, they assumed they were confronting an easy target. But the ascetic's silence was denser and more destructive than metal. The incident in the underworld demonstrates the consequences of losing control over one's ego. 60,000 warriors acted as a single mechanism, infected by a virus of superiority. Not one stopped, questioned, or attempted to analyze the situation. Their collective irresponsibility cost them their chance at survival. They were consumed by the fire of their own pride, leaving behind only hills of ash. This tragedy created a new problem for the empire, the consequences of which the state would have to face for generations. Decades passed. The ashes of 60,000 princes still lie deep within the caves of the underworld. The physical destruction of the body was not the final point of existence. A far greater threat at that time was the disruption of posthumous rites. The souls of the king's sons became trapped in a cold space between worlds. They could not continue their journey, purify themselves, or be reborn because the farewell rituals remained unfinished. In the society of that era, the well-being of the living was directly tied to the status of their ancestors. It was believed that departed family members needed regular performance of a specific ritual involving offerings of water and special rice balls called pindas. If the ritual was interrupted or not performed, the souls would experience hunger and thirst. They would lose peace and become wandering spirits. Such entities brought misfortune to their descendants, blocking prosperity for the entire state and causing illness. It was traditionally accepted that this unbreakable connection between generations formed the foundation of social and legal responsibility in ancient society. King Sagara, ruler of a vast empire that had conquered many lands, found himself powerless before the laws of karma. He never found a way to free the souls of his children. He spent the rest of his days in sorrow and passed away, leaving the throne and the heavy burden of an unfulfilled duty to his grandson, Amshuman. Amshuman spent years of his reign trying to correct the mistakes of his ancestors. He sought safe passage to the underworld, consulted with the highest priests, and undertook long ascetic practices in the forests, but his efforts bore no fruit. The ashes remained unpurified. After him, his son Dilipa became ruler. State chronicles recorded in ancient texts indicate that Dilipa also devoted his life to finding a solution. He convened councils of sages, studied ancient treatises, and sought guidance from oracles. The answer the rulers received was daunting in its impossibility. Only water possessing absolute cosmic purity could cleanse the karma of the 60,000 warriors who had offended the great ascetic. Earthly sources were inadequate for this purpose. Their energies were not enough to neutralize the sage's wrath. The waters of the heavenly river Ganges were required. At that time, the Ganges flowed only in the higher realms. Ancient texts describe it as a celestial stream bathing the abodes of the gods. According to legend, it originated from the foot of Vishnu and was known as Vishnu Padi. This stream was inaccessible to humans. No mortal knew how to compel the river to leave the celestial domains and descend to solid earth. The very idea of moving a cosmic river seemed to violate the laws of physics and the universe. It required the direct intervention of Brahma, the creator of the universe, who held the Ganges in his ritual vessel. Realizing the magnitude of the task, Dilipa fell into deep despair. He could not find a way to summon the river, became ill from grief, and passed away, leaving the problem to the next generation of rulers. This story reveals a strict concept of responsibility for the deeds of one's lineage. For the people of that era, the connection to ancestors was not limited to memory, respect, or maintaining graves. It represented a single energetic and karmic chain. A mistake made by one generation inevitably fell upon the shoulders of the next. This mechanism serves as an important marker of the mindset of that time. Individualism, as we understand it today, did not exist. A person was seen not as an independent individual, but as a link in an endless chain of their family line. If we apply this model to modern society, a natural question arises: are we today connected to the actions of our ancestors? Are we capable of bearing the burden of others' mistakes? Modern science, particularly systemic psychology and epigenetics, explores similar concepts. Researchers study how severe trauma, famine, and unresolved conflicts from the past century influence the behavior of people living today. We often inherit not only genetic traits or material debts, but also behavioral patterns from our families. However, in ancient times, this process was understood literally and required physical action. The descendants of King Sagara became hostages to the pride of others. Amshuman and Dilipa did not participate in the destruction of the land, nor raise weapons against the sage, yet they had to pay for the collective recklessness of their ancestors. This burden passed from father to son, draining the resources of the rulers. The accumulated negative karma threatened to destroy the dynasty itself, depriving the empire of legitimate heirs. A person was needed who could break this vicious cycle. That person was King Bhagiratha, the great-grandson of King Sagara. Upon ascending the throne, he inherited not only a wealthy empire, but also the heavy burden of a curse hanging over his lineage. The state treasury was being depleted by constant attempts to solve this mystical problem. Learning about the fate of the 60,000 ancestors whose souls were trapped between worlds, the new ruler made a decision that would change the course of history. In the Vedic culture of that time, it was believed that unfinished burial rites deprived the departed of peace and their descendants of protection and prosperity. Spirits unable to find their way to the ancestral realm, known as Pitri Loka, became sources of misfortune for the living. Understanding the scale of the threat, Bhagiratha convened a council of ministers. He gave detailed instructions to his advisors on managing state affairs, delegated authority among military leaders and treasurers, ensuring the stability of the administration during his absence. After this, he removed his royal adornments, left the palace, and journeyed north to the snow-capped peaks of the Himalayas. According to ancient legends, Bhagiratha chose a secluded place in the mountains for his ascetic practice, far from trade routes and settlements of priests. The practice of renunciation, known in Indian tradition as tapasya, required complete submission of the body to the will of the mind. It was believed that voluntary physical deprivation generated inner energy capable of influencing the fabric of the universe and attracting the attention of the gods. He began by changing his diet. At first, he ate only dry leaves and fallen fruits, completely giving up agricultural products. Then he subsisted solely on water from mountain streams, and after several years, he sustained himself on air alone. The ancient epics describing this story differ on the exact length of his ordeal, but agree on the methods. Bhagiratha stood on one leg with his arms raised to the sky. He remained motionless under the scorching summer sun, endured heavy monsoon rains, and braved icy winds in winter. His skin darkened from the sun and became coated with dust. Seasons changed around him, trees grew and withered. Wild animals grew accustomed to his presence and ceased to pay him any attention. His body withered, becoming little more than skin stretched over bones. Veins became visible, but his focus on the goal remained unshakable. The ruler quieted the turmoil of his mind, focusing his consciousness on a single purpose. After centuries of such practice, having accumulated a vast reserve of inner energy, Mahagaratha disturbed the balance in the higher realms. Before him appeared Brahma, the creator of the universe. The supreme deity offered the ascetic a gift in reward for his steadfastness. The former monarch did not ask for youth restored, expansion of his kingdom's borders, or immortality. His request concerned only the salvation of his ancestors. He asked permission for the celestial river Ganges to leave the cosmic halls and descend to earth. Only its waters, possessing absolute purity, could cleanse the karmic burden from the ashes of the sons of Sagara and open their path to the higher worlds. Brahma agreed to grant the request, but revealed a technical problem tied to the laws governing the universe. The Ganges carried such mass and speed that its direct descent from the cosmos would inevitably split the Earth's crust, destroying all life and piercing the planet down to the subterranean realm of Patala. The waters would wash away mountains and flood continents, turning the land into a barren wasteland. The creator advised Bhagirath to find one who could act as a buffer, absorbing the initial impact of the falling waters and softening their descent. This ruler's figure became a symbol of determination in Indian culture. Even today, in classical literature and everyday speech on the Indian subcontinent, arduous long-term labour demanding dedication is referred to as the effort of Bhagiratha. This story invites us to explore the phenomenon of human motivation and hidden reserves. Having a clear goal beyond selfish interests enables a person to overcome the physiological limits of their own body. When fully devoted to an idea, the body reallocates its resources in a completely different way. He did not seek personal gain. He was driven by a deep sense of duty to his lineage and understanding of his role within the chain of generations. This responsibility became the fuel that allowed him to ignore hunger, pain, and the passage of time. Within the context of the Treta Yuga, this myth illustrates a paradigm shift. Whereas before blessings were granted by birthright, now achieving results required efforts far beyond the capacities of an ordinary person. The king proved that willpower could alter the cosmic order, compelling the celestial river to change its course. However, solving one problem created another. The ruler now had to find a being whose physical strength could hold the ocean falling from the heavens. The only entity capable of withstanding such a force was the god Shiva. Mahagaratha immersed himself once more in asceticism, directing his prayers to Shiva. According to tradition, the king meditated for an entire year, standing on his toes with his arms raised high. Shiva, deeply focused on the snowy peak of Mount Kailash, responded to the ruler's plea. He agreed to become a shield for the planet and took his position on a rocky plateau, awaiting the descent of the waters. The Ganges crashed down from the heavens. According to the epic Ramayana, the celestial river possessed its own consciousness and immense pride. It believed that nothing in the material universe could halt its flow. The Ganges intended to use its entire mass to break through the Earth's crust, destroy the mountains, and sweep Shiva straight into the underworld. The torrent fell with a deafening roar. Ancient authors describe how celestial beings, Gandharvas, Yakshas and Asuras, gathered in aerial chariots to witness the event. The waters carried heavenly fish, enormous serpents, radiant lotuses, and dense streams of energy capable of splitting continents. The sound of the falling water stunned the animals on land, but the god remained unshaken. He caught the descending ocean in his tangled, matted hair, known as jata. For Indian ascetics, such hair symbolizes accumulated inner strength and complete detachment from worldly care of the body. The river was trapped. It lost its destructive kinetic energy, wandering through the endless labyrinths of Shiva's locks. The Ganges struggled within this structure for many years, seeking an escape, until its pride was fully subdued. Only then did Shiva allow the water to flow gently to earth in small streams, forming the mountain lake Bindu Sarovar. The Puranic texts mention how the water, upon touching the land, divided into 7 branches. 3 streams flowed east, 3 west, and the 7th followed Bhagiratha's chariot. The king led the way, moving forward, and the river obediently flowed behind, reviving the sun-scorched lands. Along this route, another obstacle arose. The waters of the Ganges accidentally flooded the sacrificial altar of the sage Janu, washing away his ritual implements. Angered, the elder drank the entire river in one gulp. Bhagiratha had to employ diplomacy once again, halting the flow and asking for forgiveness for the damage caused. The pacified sage released the Ganges from his right ear, after which she received a new name, Jahnavi, the daughter of Janu. Having crossed the plains, the waters entered a deep fissure previously carved by an army of princes. They descended into Patala, the lower realms of existence, where sunlight does not reach, and the space is illuminated only by the glow of precious gems. The stream washed over the ashes of 60,000 sons of King Sagara. Contact with the consecrated water completed the interrupted funeral rites. The souls of the ancestors were freed from the space between worlds and ascended to the higher abodes. Bhagiratha's mission was accomplished. Scholars and historians continue to debate whether this myth encodes real engineering knowledge about water distribution and flood prevention. Researchers suggest that the ancient inhabitants of the Indian subcontinent encrypted in the epic the mechanisms of the hydrosphere. The Himalayas serve as a natural barrier for the monsoons, and glaciers gradually release moisture to the valleys. In this interpretation, Shiva's hair is an exact allegory for the dense Himalayan forests and winding mountain gorges. Vegetation and complex terrain slow down the rapid flows of meltwater, preventing them from washing away fertile soil and destroying agricultural settlements. The sage Janu, who drinks the river, likely symbolises the drying up of riverbeds during droughts, or the water's retreat into underground karst cavities. The philosophical aspect of this story invites us to consider Shiva as a universal stabilizer. In any complex system, whether a government or an individual psyche, it is vital to have a buffer capable of softening unforeseen blows of fate. Shiva demonstrates an effective way to manage uncontrollable forces. He does not repel the flow or build a fragile dam destined to collapse under pressure. Instead, the god absorbs the aggressive energy, dissipates it within a complex internal structure, and releases it safely and constructively. Chaos transforms into a resource. The human ability to act as such a buffer, processing external stress into useful experience without destroying one's identity, is a key survival skill. The capacity to accept the finiteness of one's path without panic requires strict self-discipline. Concluding the overview of the Treta Yuga, it is fitting to turn to the story of a ruler whose choice became a model of such detachment. The texts preserve the legend of King Katvanga, who belonged to an ancient solar dynasty, tracing its lineage to the sun god Surya. The king's name means one who fights with a club made from a bedpost. He earned this title after losing his primary weapon in battle, tearing off a wooden support from his royal bed and continuing the fight. Having broken the enemy ranks, Katvanga was renowned for his martial skill and precise fulfillment of his duties. His reputation as a strategist reached the higher realms. According to the epic, during that time, a new conflict erupted between gods and demons. The Asuras amassed their forces, breached the defences of the celestial spheres, and began to press the gods. Recognizing their shortage of military talent, the Devas turned to the earthly ruler for help. Katvanga entrusted the governance of the kingdom to a trusted minister and ascended to the heavenly realm to lead the army of light. The battle was long and arduous. The earthly king applied his tactical skills, regrouped the divine forces, shattered the ranks of the Asuras, and restored order in the higher worlds. After the victory, the celestial beings gathered around the ruler. In gratitude, they offered him any gift he desired. Katvanga had the right to ask for immortality in the heavenly abodes, unlimited wealth, dominion over all the continents of the earth, or eternal health. Studying ancient texts reveals a pattern. Rulers in Indian epics typically use such a wish to acquire rare weapons, expand their territories, or secure the safety of their descendants. But Khatvanga acted differently. A pragmatic man, he asked the gods only one question: how much time did he have left in his physical body? The gods, who understood the laws of time, answered plainly. The king's life would end exactly after one muhurta. In Vedic astronomy, a day is divided into 30 equal parts, and one muhurta equals 48 minutes. Upon hearing this precise time frame, Khatvanga immediately declined the heavenly gifts. Wealth, power, and physical pleasures lost all meaning in the face of the impending transition. He requested only one thing: to be swiftly returned to his earthly domain. Once back in his kingdom, the ruler did not summon a council to formally transfer power. He did not rush to bid farewell to his wives or order the construction of monuments. Instead, he chose to spend the remaining 48 minutes preparing his consciousness. Khatvanga sat down in the lotus position and began systematically detaching himself from social and material ties. First, he ceased thoughts of the state, the army, and the treasury. Then, he let go of worries about family and heirs. Finally, he severed the psychological connection with his own body. His state is described in the 9th canto of the Bhagavata Purana. Even my own life is not as dear to me as the supreme truth. Therefore, I will not allow my mind to cling to anything but it. The king immersed his mind in contemplation of the source of creation and left this world in a state of absolute peace. This story offers a vivid illustration of human consciousness functioning under strict time constraints. In daily life, people tend to postpone reflecting on the meaning of existence indefinitely. The illusion of endless time breeds restlessness. Energy is wasted accumulating possessions that cannot be taken along and engaging in conflicts insignificant over decades. Awareness of finiteness acts as a filter. It instantly cuts away everything unnecessary. For Khatvanga, those 48 minutes became the essence of his entire life. In that brief span, he reached a state that many spiritual practitioners strive for over years in Himalayan caves. The secret lay in complete focus and freedom from regrets about the past. The historical context of the Treta Yuga plays an important role here. During this era, rituals became extremely elaborate. The Brahmanas insisted that a proper completion of the earthly journey required long ceremonies, hymn recitations, and strict burial rites. Khatvanga's act breaks this system. He demonstrates in practice that pure intention and mental mastery can replace years of mechanical actions. No fires, altars, or priests were needed for the transition. Only silence. The king's behavior prompts reflection on priorities. If a person were told their time would end in an hour, their focus would shift dramatically. The desire for social status or financial superiority would vanish, replaced by a search for inner balance. Our journey through the Treta Yuga is approaching its natural conclusion. Like everything in this material world, this epoch had its destined sunset. The departure of the 7th avatar of Vishnu, Rama, marked the beginning of the end. The Ramayana describes this not as a sudden tragedy, but as a planned return to the original source. Rama fulfilled his duty and established a kingdom on earth known in Indian tradition as Ramrajya. According to the sage Valmiki, during this period, law prevailed over personal ambition. People were free from severe illnesses, and the earth yielded abundant harvests without harsh effort. Yet the cosmic clock continued ticking. After millennia of rule, Rama left this world. According to the Uttarakanda, time itself appeared to the king of Ayodhya in the form of an ascetic. The messenger reminded the ruler that his earthly term had ended and imposed a strict condition. Their conversation must remain secret, and anyone who interrupted it would face exile. The king entrusted the guarding of his chamber doors to his brother Lakshmana. At that moment, the fiery sage Durvasa arrived at the palace, demanding immediate audience and threatening to curse the kingdom if refused. Lakshmana decided to disobey his brother's order and entered the chamber, saving the people from the sage's wrath at the cost of his own position. Following the law, Rama had to renounce his brother. Lakshmana went to the banks of the Sarayu river and ceased breathing in deep meditation. Soon after, Rama transferred the governance of the kingdom to his sons, Lava and Kusha, dividing the territories between them. Then he left the palace grounds. The devoted rulers and citizens undertook the Mahaprasthana, the Great Departure. They journeyed on foot to the Sarayu River's banks and entered its waters. This act of complete physical renunciation marked the turning point for the change of world ages. With Rama's departure, the commitment to honour that characterised the people of that time began to fade rapidly. Indian cosmology holds that the symbolic bull of Dharma lost its second leg. The foundation of society wavered. Vedic rituals began to lose their original spiritual essence. While at the beginning of the Treta Yuga complex ceremonies were performed to maintain cosmic balance, by its end they had become purely mechanical acts. Rulers started using grand sacrifices solely to gain power, expand borders, and accumulate material wealth. The Brahmana texts and Vedic commentaries record this historic shift in detail. The priestly class focused increasingly on the precise pronunciation of syllables and exact geometric proportions of brick altars. The inner state of the worshipper, their sincerity and purity of intention, became secondary. Doubts about the justice of the divine order arose in people's hearts. The loss of direct contact with higher powers bred fear of the future. All this foreshadowed the coming of the next age, the Dvapara Yuga. In the forthcoming era, humanity would need to physically record sacred texts and divide the unified Veda into 4 parts, as memory would weaken and lifespans shorten. The ancient legends of the Treta Yuga are not merely monuments of antiquity. They offer profound insight into human nature, standing at the crossroads of 2 worlds, the departing age of harmony and the approaching time of pragmatism. Though not officially confirmed, many scholars see in these texts a reflection of humanity's historical transition from early communities to complex states with bureaucracy and social stratification. This era revealed a key truth. When original harmony collapses under time's weight, conscious choice by the individual must take its place. A choice between selfishness and duty, between desire and eternal truth. In the Aranyaparva, the forest book of the Mahabharata, the sage Markandeya addresses King Yudhishthira with a precise description of this process. Time creates all beings, and time destroys them. Time burns worlds and also extinguishes fire. Time is awake when all sleep, for time cannot be deceived. Though those times have passed, flowing away like the waters of the Sarayu River, the questions they raise remain as relevant as ever. Each generation must once again decide what to rely on when familiar ways begin to crack and old rules no longer hold. The responsibility for maintaining inner order rests on the shoulders of the people themselves. I hope this lecture has offered you a moment away from daily concerns and provided food for thought. Studying ancient texts allows us to view our actions through the lens of millennia. Thank you for your attention to detail and for joining in this journey through history. We will meet again in future discussions. You've been watching Ancient Secrets. Thanks for watching and have a great day.